In the autumn of 1971, a man used to come to our house, bearing confections in his pockets in the hopes of ascertaining the life and death of his family. His name was Mr. Prose, and he came from Bangladesh, then a part of Pakistan. That year, Pakistan was engaged in civil war. He came to our house to eat dinner and watch the evening news. One evening, I asked my mother to hand me a fourth glass. "What is it, Lilia?" "A glass for the Indian man." "Mr. Prose is no longer considered Indian," my father announced. "Not since partition." He told me that during partitions, Hindus and Muslims had set fire to each other's homes. It made no sense to me. Mr. Prose and my parents spoke the same language, laughed at the same jokes, looked more or less the same. Nevertheless, my father insisted that I know the difference. One of the hardest things about the coronavirus pandemic has been the fact that we're all alone, away from our friends, family, basically everyone. But there's a certain solace in the fact that we're all in it together. Everyone's going through the exact same thing. Such is not the case for Mr. Prose, stranded in the United States while his home country of Pakistan is engulfed in civil war. When Mr. Prose came to dine by Yumpa Lahiri. The next evening, Mr. Prose arrived, as usual, at 6 o'clock. "Another refugee, I'm afraid, on Indian territory. They're estimating 9 million at the last count," my father said. Mr. Prose reached into his suit pocket and gave me a small plastic egg filled with cinnamon hearts. "For the lady of the house," he said. It was an awkward moment for me, one which I awaited part with dread, in part with delight. I was flattered by the faint theatricality of his actions, yet unsettled by the superb ease of his gestures, which made me feel like a stranger in my own home. That night, like every night, we did not eat at the dining table because it did not provide an unobstructed view of the television set. Instead, we huddled around the coffee table without conversing, our plates perched upon our knees. Before eating, Mr. Prose always did a curious thing. He took out a plain silver pocket watch set to the local time in Dhaka, 11 hours ahead. When I saw it that night, an uneasiness possessed me. Life, I realized, was being lived in Dhaka first. Our meals, our actions were only a shadow of what had already happened there, a lagging ghost of where Mr. Prose really belonged. At 6:30, when the national news began, my father raised the volume and adjusted the antennas. The images flashed in miniature across Mr. Prose's eyes. As he watched, he had an immovable expression on his face, composed but alert, as if someone were giving him directions to an unknown destination. That night, when I placed the plastic egg filled with cinnamon hearts beside my bed, I did not feel the ceremonious satisfaction I normally did. My stomach tightened as I worried whether Mr. Prose's wife and 7 daughters were now members of the drifting, clamoring mass that had flashed at intervals on the screen. I began to convince myself that Mr. Prose's family was in all likelihood dead. Eventually, I took a square of white chocolate out of the box and did something I had never done before. I put the chocolate in my mouth and I chewed it softly, and I prayed that Mr. Prose's family was safe and sound. I had never prayed for anything before, but I decided, given the circumstances, that it was something I should do. As weeks passed, it grew more and more rare to see footage from Dhaka on the news. In spite of it all, night after night, my parents and Mr. Prose enjoyed long, leisurely meals. I wanted, above all, to console Mr. Prose somehow. But apart from eating a piece of candy and praying for his family's safety, there was nothing I could do. One October, Mr. Prose asked upon arrival, "What are these large orange vegetables on people's doorsteps? A type of squash?" "Pumpkins," my mother replied. "And the purpose?" "You make a jack-o'-lantern," I said, grinning ferociously. "Like this, to scare people away." "I see," said Mr. Pruzada, grinning back. Very useful. The next day, my mother bought a 10-pound pumpkin. I wanted to carve it properly. Let's carve it, Mr. Pruzada agreed. Hang the news tonight. For the first time, we all gathered around the dining table, my mother, my father, Mr. Pruzada, and I, dutifully carved. Mr. Pruzada had nearly finished when the national news began. The reporter mentioned East Pakistan, and we all turned to listen. Unless the world helped to relieve the burden of East Pakistani refugees, India would go to war against Pakistan. The knife slipped from Mr. Pruzada's hand, made a gash dipping towards the base of the pumpkin. Please forgive me. It is terrible. I will buy another. I will try again. Not at all, not at all, my father said. He took the knife and carved around the gash, evening it out. Our jack-o'-lantern wore an expression of placid astonishment. When Mr. Pruzada arrived, he presented me with a box of chocolate-covered mints. Don't go into houses you don't know, my father warned. Mr. Pruzada knit his eyebrows together. Is there any danger? Perhaps I should accompany them. He suddenly looked tired and small. His eyes contained a panic I had never seen before. Don't worry, I said. It was the first time I had uttered those words to Mr. Pruzada, 2 simple words I had tried but failed to tell him for weeks. It shamed me now that I had just uttered them for my own sake. We went from house to house, pressing doorbells. By the time we reached Dora's house, our hands were chapped and our feet were sore and swollen. Dora's mother drove me back to my house. I saw that our pumpkin had been shattered, its thick shell strewn in chunks across the grass. I felt the sting of tears in my eyes and a sudden pain in my throat. I opened the door, expecting the 3 of them to be standing in the foyer, waiting to receive me and to grieve our ruined pumpkin. But there was no one. In the living room, Mr. Pruzada, my mother, and my father were sitting side by side on the sofa. Mr. Pruzada held his head in his hands. India and Pakistan were drawing closer to war. I remember the 3 of them operating during that time as if they were a single person, sharing a single meal, a single body, a single silence, and a single fear. In January, Mr. Pruzada flew back to his home to discover what was left of it. Finally, several months later, we received a letter from Mr. Pruzada. He was reunited with his family. To celebrate the good news, my mother prepared a special dinner. And when we sat down to eat, we toasted. But I did not feel like celebrating. Though I had not seen him for months, it was only then that I felt Mr. Pruzada's absence. It was only then that I knew what it meant to miss someone who was so many miles and hours away.